Jasmine Crockett stood in the Supreme Court chamber, the marble columns towering behind her, as she faced Chief Justice John Roberts across the polished wooden bench. The tension in the room was electric, as cameras captured every moment of this historic confrontation. Just seconds earlier, Roberts had openly laughed at Crockett's opening statement on voting rights, a dismissive chuckle that echoed through the hallowed chamber and sent whispers rippling through the gallery. Crockett, the 42-year-old Congresswoman from Texas, with her signature braided hairstyle and bold red blazer, didn't flinch as Roberts smirked. His silver hair caught the light as he leaned back in his high-backed chair, clearly thinking he had the upper hand against this newer member of Congress. But Crockett, a former criminal defense attorney with over a decade of courtroom experience, saw his laughter for what it was, an opportunity to turn the tables on the most powerful judge in America. Gripping her notes tightly, eyes locked on Roberts, she paused just long enough for the room to go completely silent. This wasn't just another Supreme Court argument. This was Jasmine Crockett's moment to stand up to the conservative Chief Justice and defend voting rights in a way nobody expected. Before we dive deeper into this incredible confrontation, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. You won't want to miss a single moment of this powerful showdown. The Supreme Court chamber buzzed with anticipation as Chief Justice John Roberts presided over the critical voting rights case that had captured the nation's attention. Roberts, appointed by President George W. Bush in 2005, had spent nearly 2 decades shaping American law from the nation's highest court. His conservative legal philosophy and commanding presence had made him one of the most influential figures in modern judicial history. Today, the 69-year-old Chief Justice wore his trademark confidence like armor. His posture relaxed as he looked down from the bench at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He had been particularly dismissive during her opening remarks about the impact of recent voting laws on minority communities. Congresswoman Crockett, Roberts began, his voice carrying that distinctive tone of authority that had intimidated countless attorneys before him. You claim these state voting laws create insurmountable barriers for certain communities, but the statistics simply don't support such dramatic conclusions. Perhaps we should stick to facts rather than emotional appeals. A subtle laugh escaped his lips, the kind meant to diminish and dismiss. Several conservative justices nodded in agreement. Justice Thomas even leaned over to whisper something to Justice Alito. Both men smiling in a way that made their position clear. The right side of the gallery filled with conservative legal observers murmured approvingly. Crockett stood firm at the podium, her background making her uniquely qualified for this moment. Before joining Congress, she had built her reputation as a fierce civil rights attorney in Texas, defending the vulnerable and fighting against systemic injustice. Her election to Congress in 2022 had been historic, and she quickly established herself as a powerful voice for voting rights and electoral justice. Growing up in St. Louis, in a middle-class black family, Crockett had witnessed firsthand how voting barriers affected her community. She had worked her way through law school, often facing the same dismissive attitudes now displayed by Roberts. But those experiences had only strengthened her resolve. If I may respond to your characterization, Chief Justice Roberts, Crockett began, her voice steady, and the room fell silent. All eyes on this. Confrontation between the established Chief Justice and the Congresswoman who refused to be intimidated. Backstage, Crockett's aide frantically passed a note to her legal team. "We need the Michigan research now." The team quickly pulled up data on their tablets, statistical evidence Roberts couldn't laugh away. "With all due respect, Chief Justice," Crockett continued, her voice gaining power, with each word, dismissing documented voter suppression as emotional appeals shows precisely why we're here today. She stepped slightly to the right, strategically positioning herself where the cameras could capture both her and Roberts in the same frame. Roberts's smile faded slightly. He hadn't expected such direct pushback. "Congresswoman, this court deals with constitutional interpretation, not political talking points. The facts show that voting participation has actually increased in some of these states." The tension in the room escalated as Justice Samuel Alito jumped in, clearly trying to support Roberts. "I've reviewed your brief, Congresswoman, and I must say, I find little constitutional basis for your argument. Aren't you really asking this court to legislate from the bench?" Murmurs spread through the conservative side of the gallery. A few nodded vigorously. Cameras capturing their approval. Crockett noticed a Fox News reporter scribbling notes, already framing this as Crockett being outmatched by the court's conservative wing. But Crockett wasn't backing down. "Justice Alito, I'm asking this court to uphold the Constitution, which expressly protects the right to vote. When states create barriers that disproportionately affect specific communities, they violate that constitutional protection." Roberts leaned forward, his expression hardening. "The Constitution doesn't guarantee convenience, Congresswoman. If voters need to make a bit more effort, Chief Justice," Crockett interrupted, something rarely done with the Chief Justice. The room went completely silent. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Her team passed her a tablet showing statistics from 3 key states. Crockett glanced at it briefly, then looked directly at Roberts. "Let me share some facts, since you're concerned about emotions overtaking this discussion." She pulled out a document and placed it on the podium. In Madison County, Georgia, after new voting laws were implemented, Black voters had to travel an average of 17 miles to the nearest polling location, while white voters averaged 4.3 miles. "Is that just a bit more effort, Chief Justice?" Roberts shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting such specific data. "Individual counties may have implementation challenges, but this isn't about individual counties." Crockett pressed. "This is systematic. In Arizona, waiting times in predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods averaged 4.5 hours, compared to 22 minutes in predominantly white neighborhoods. During the last election, is that just a bit more effort too?" Justice Barrett leaned forward, seemingly more receptive to these points than her colleagues. "Congresswoman, could these disparities be explained by population density or resource allocation rather than intentional discrimination?" "An excellent question, Justice Barrett," Crockett acknowledged, her tone respectful but unwavering. "If these were random distribution problems, we would see comparable effects across demographic groups, but that's not what the data shows." Crockett turned to her legal team, who handed her another document. "This report from the Justice Department identifies 47 instances where polling locations were moved with less than 2 weeks' notice, 41 of which were in neighborhoods with majority-minority populations. These aren't coincidences. Roberts's expression had changed from dismissive to concerned. His earlier laughter now seemed inappropriate as Crockett methodically laid out evidence that couldn't easily be dismissed. Justice Thomas, usually silent during oral arguments, surprisingly, spoke up. "Congresswoman, even if these disparities exist, where in the Constitution does it say that all voting locations must be equally convenient?" The conservative side of the gallery nodded in agreement. A few even applauded softly before being silenced by court officers. Crockett took a deep breath. This was the moment to address the core issue. "Justice Thomas, the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. When state actions result in some Americans having their fundamental rights substantially burdened, compared to others, based on race or location, that protection is violated." She paused, making eye contact with each justice. "This isn't about convenience. It's about equal access to our most fundamental right as Americans." Roberts, clearly wanting to regain control of the situation, tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's focus on the specific provisions in question. The states argue they're simply securing the integrity of elections. With respect, Chief Justice, we've heard that justification before in our nation's history." Crockett replied, her voice taking on a historic weight. "The same argument was used to defend poll taxes and literacy tests." The gallery erupted in hushed conversations. The significance of her comparison hung in the air. Liberal justices sat up straighter, while conservative justices exchanged glances. Roberts, visibly frustrated by losing the narrative, laughed again, a short dismissive sound meant to diminish her point. Congresswoman Crockett, comparing modern election security measures to Jim Crow laws is exactly the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that clouds rational legal discourse. The moment his laughter echoed through the chamber, Crockett knew she had him. Her expression remained steady as cameras captured Roberts's dismissive attitude, in contrast to her professional demeanor. "Chief Justice," she said, her voice now carrying an authority that silenced the room. "Perhaps you find the comparison uncomfortable, but for the Americans waiting 7 hours to cast their vote, while others wait 20 minutes, the distinction feels far less dramatic." Crockett moved closer to the podium, her posture strong and commanding. The chamber remained completely silent, every justice now fully engaged. This was the moment that would define this historic confrontation. "Chief Justice Roberts," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "you laughed earlier when I mentioned barriers to voting, and you just laughed again when I made a historical comparison. I wonder, is voter suppression amusing to you?" The directness of her question sent shock waves through the chamber. Several journalists frantically typed on their phones. Roberts's face flushed slightly, realizing his dismissive gesture had been noticed by everyone. "I wasn't laughing at voter suppression, Congresswoman," he said stiffly. "I was expressing skepticism at what I consider hyperbole." "I understand, sir," Crockett replied, "but I'd like to show you why many Americans don't share your skepticism." In a sign, she signaled to her team, who projected a large map onto the screen, permitted for evidence presentations. The map showed county-by-county waiting times across several states, with predominantly minority areas clearly showing longer wait times in red and orange. This data comes directly from state election boards, Crockett explained, not advocacy groups, not partisan think tanks, but official government data. She flipped to the next slide, showing polling place closures in Georgia since the new voting laws took effect. Over 200 polling locations closed, 80% in areas with large black populations. Coincidence? The liberal justices leaned forward, clearly engaged with the evidence. Justice Sotomayor nodded slightly. Roberts attempted to regain control. Statistical correlations don't necessarily prove discriminatory intent, Congresswoman. These closures could be explained by budget constraints or facility availability. And this was exactly the opening Crockett had been waiting for. I'm glad you raised that point, Chief Justice, she said, her voice gaining strength, because we have evidence directly addressing that issue. She nodded to her team again, who projected an email exchange between Georgia election officials. The highlighted portion read, consolidating these 5 locations into one will significantly reduce turnout in District 5, which tends to vote 70% Democratic. Budget constraints provide perfect cover. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Several reporters rushed out to file breaking news alerts. This email was obtained through a FOIA request just last month. Crockett explained, and it's not isolated. She flipped to the next slide, showing similar communications from officials in Arizona and North Carolina. Each one revealed the strategic nature of voting restrictions, not to secure elections, but to suppress specific votes. Roberts sat completely still, his earlier dismissive demeanor replaced by grave concern. The evidence was too specific, too direct to laugh away. Congresswoman, Justice Kagan interjected, this evidence seems to directly contradict the state's claim that these measures are solely about election security. Precisely. Justice Kagan, Crockett responded, when officials explicitly discuss reducing turnout from specific demographics, they reveal the true purpose of these laws. She turned back to face Roberts directly. Chief Justice, you laughed because you thought I was exaggerating, but for millions of Americans, these barriers aren't theoretical legal arguments. They're the difference between having a voice in our democracy or being silenced. Crockett then pulled out her most compelling evidence. Sworn affidavit from voters who had been turned away despite standing in line for hours, including an 80-year-old veteran who had voted in every election since 1964 until being disenfranchised in 2022. Mr. James Henderson waited for 5 hours, she said, her voice carrying emotional weight while remaining professionally composed. At 6 p.m., with dozens still in line, officials closed the polling location. In the neighboring county, predominantly white polls remained open until the last person in line at 7 p.m. had voted, as required by law. She paused, looking directly at Roberts. Chief Justice, when you laughed earlier, I wonder if Mr. Henderson would find it as amusing. Roberts's face showed he recognized his serious misstep. His earlier laughter now made him appear callous in the face of compelling human testimony. The Constitution you've sworn to protect guarantees equal protection, Crockett continued. When laws are weaponized to silence specific communities, this court has not just the authority, but the duty to intervene. Then came her master stroke. Crockett quoted Roberts's own words from a 2013 case back to him. Equal justice under law requires the neutral application of principles. Chief Justice, you wrote those words. She said, today I'm simply asking you to apply them consistently. The chamber fell completely silent. Roberts, faced with his own legal reasoning being turned against him so effectively, had no immediate response. His earlier laughter now seemed not just inappropriate but revelatory of an unconscious bias. Liberal justices exchanged meaningful glances, clearly impressed by Crockett's strategy. Even some conservative justices appeared troubled by the evidence present. Congresswoman Crockett, Roberts finally said, his tone markedly different. You've presented concerning evidence that deserves serious consideration. Gone was the dismissive laughter, replaced by the sober attention her arguments had earned. Justice Barrett leaned forward. I'd like to better understand the practical remedies you're proposing. How would the court address these disparities without overstepping into state election administration? This engaged question from a conservative justice signaled a significant shift in the room's dynamics. Crockett had successfully moved the conversation from dismissal to substantive discussion. Justice Barrett, I believe the remedy is clear, Crockett responded confidently. When states implement voting changes, they must demonstrate these changes won't disproportionately burden specific communities. This standard doesn't require identical convenience, it simply requires equal access to our most fundamental right. She then outlined a three-part test that courts could apply to evaluate voting laws, balancing state interests with constitutional protections. Her proposal was nuanced, acknowledging legitimate state concerns while establishing clear limits against discriminatory effects. As she finished her argument, Crockett stood tall at the podium, having transformed from someone Roberts laughed at to someone he was forced to take seriously. The dynamics had shifted so dramatically that several court observers were already calling this one of the most effective arguments they'd witnessed in years. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, Roberts said, formally, his tone now respectful. You've given this court much to consider. As the Supreme Court session concluded, the impact of the confrontation between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts reverberated far beyond the chamber's marble walls. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, as legal analysts attempted to make sense of the dramatic exchange they'd just witnessed. Crockett emerged from the Supreme Court building, her red blazer visible from a distance, as journalists rushed toward her. She maintained her professional composure, but the quiet confidence in her expression told the story of someone who knew she had just delivered a defining performance. Congresswoman, did you expect the Chief Justice to laugh at your arguments? Shouted one reporter. I didn't come here expecting laughter, Crockett responded evenly. I came with evidence, legal reasoning, and the voices of Americans being denied their constitutional rights. The facts speak for themselves. Within minutes, clips of Roberts's dismissive laughter, juxtaposed with Crockett's powerful evidence presentation, flooded social media. The hashtag Van Crockett's shutdown Roberts began trending nationwide, with hundreds of thousands of shares in the first hour alone. MSNBC's legal correspondent reported live from the courthouse steps, what we witnessed today was extraordinary. Chief Justice Roberts, known for his controlled courtroom demeanor, visibly shifted from dismissive to deeply concerned as Congresswoman Crockett systematically presented evidence that couldn't be laughed away. Fox News took a different angle. Congresswoman Crockett confronted the Chief Justice in an unusually direct manner today, raising questions about courtroom decorum. Yet even their legal analysts acknowledged the strength of the evidence presented, with one conservative commentator admitting, "Whatever your position on these voting laws, the emails shown today raise serious concerns about the intentions behind them." On social media, the contrast was striking. A clip of Roberts laughing immediately followed by Crockett asking if voter suppression amused him had been viewed over 2 million times within hours. Users shared their own voting experiences, with thousands describing barriers they'd faced at polling places. One tweet went viral. "Today, Jasmine Crockett made John Roberts laugh at voters, then made him listen to voters. That's what representation looks like." It had been retweeted over 50,000 times. CNN invited constitutional law experts to analyze the confrontation. Professor Lawrence Tribe observed, "What made Crockett's argument so effective wasn't just the evidence, but how she used Roberts's own judicial philosophy against him by quoting his previous opinions. She forced him to confront his own inconsistency." Inside the Supreme Court, the justices gathered in their conference room to discuss the case. Sources close to the court later revealed that the conversation was unusually heated. "The evidence presented today cannot simply be dismissed," Justice Sotomayor reportedly argued. "When state officials explicitly discuss reducing turnout from specific communities, it crosses the line from election security to voter suppression." Even Justice Gorsuch, typically aligned with conservative positions, expressed concern about the email evidence. "Whatever our judicial philosophy, we cannot ignore clear evidence of improper intent," he reportedly stated. Roberts, still recovering from his public misstep, found himself in a difficult position. His dismissive laughter had been captured on camera, and contrasted sharply with Crockett's methodical, evidence-based approach. The optics weren't good. He knew it. Back on Capitol Hill, Crockett received a hero's welcome from colleagues. Representatives from both parties approached her to discuss her performance. "You did something rare today," Congressman Jim Clyburn told her. "You made the Supreme Court listen, not just to legal arguments, but to the real experiences of voters." Even some Republican representatives privately acknowledged the strength of her case. "She came with receipts," one was overheard saying. President Biden called Crockett personally, putting the call on speakerphone. As staff gathered around, "Congresswoman, you stood up for American voters today, with extraordinary effectiveness. Those emails you presented, that's the kind of evidence that changes minds." Legal experts began incorporating the Crockett-Roberts exchange into their curriculum. Several law professors used it as a case study in effective advocacy. "What made Crockett's approach so powerful," wrote Yale law professor Akil Reed Amar, "was her ability to move seamlessly between constitutional principle, statistical evidence, and human impact, all while maintaining the professional demeanor required in that setting." The most lasting impact, however, was on voters themselves. Registration drives across the country reported significant increases in participation, especially in communities most affected by voting restrictions. Organizers cited the Crockett-Roberts exchange as a galvanizing moment that translated legal arguments into terms everyone could understand. Today wasn't just about a legal argument, Crockett told supporters at a voting rights rally the following weekend. It was about making sure every American's voice matters equally. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court laughs at barriers to voting, it tells us exactly why we need to keep fighting. She paused, looking out at the crowd, but when that same Chief Justice is forced to seriously engage with the evidence, it shows us that the fight is worth it, that progress is possible, that our democracy can still respond when we stand up and demand equal justice under law. As the Supreme Court's decision date approached, legal experts remained divided on the likely outcome, but one thing was certain. Jasmine Crockett had transformed the conversation around voting rights, turning what might have been a quietly overlooked case into a national reckoning on the meaning of equal access to democracy. In television interviews, Crockett remained focused on the bigger picture. "This isn't about me or Chief Justice Roberts," she said on Meet the Press. "It's about whether our democracy truly represents everyone. When officials deliberately make it harder for certain communities to vote, they're not just attacking those communities, they're attacking the very foundation of our republic." The legacy of that day in the Supreme Court, when a dismissive laugh transformed into serious judicial consideration, would continue to shape American democracy long after the eventual ruling. Crockett had shown that, with preparation, evidence, and moral clarity, even the highest court in the land could be held accountable. Thanks for watching this incredible showdown between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how Crockett turned Roberts's laughter into a powerful moment for voting rights, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, so you never miss our latest political analysis. Drop a comment below, telling us what you thought of Crockett's strategy. We'll be back soon with more coverage of the biggest confrontations shaping America's future.